Go back to, we talk about, if you look at the broad picture of migration, say since 1990, essentially it was the advent of the Blair Labour government which changed so much, wasn't it, Andrew? I mean, before then, as I understand it, net migration was around about 50,000, and then from the moment, almost 1997, the Labour government seems to have been entirely pivotal in changing the course of migration. Would you say that's right?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. It changed beyond recognition under the Blair government. It was done by underhand methods, and indeed to the extent that Blair's memoirs barely mention immigration, despite having transformed the situation. But it so happens that one of their members blew the gaff.
This was the case of
somebody called Andrew Neather.
Andrew Neather.
Now,
yes.
he was a speechwriter for Tony Blair. He then went to the Home Office and wrote, himself says he wrote the draft of the speech that Mrs. Roach gave.
This is Barbara Roach.
Barbara Roach. Yes. She was then the Minister of Immigration.
Yes.
That kicked off this whole thing. And if I may, I'd like to quote some sentences from his article 10 years later in the Evening Standard.
Yes.
I've got
so this would have been around about 2008?
2009 it was.
2009.
Exactly 10 years ago. 10 years ago yesterday, I think.
Okay.
It makes the most extraordinary reading.
Yes. Today,
in the light of how it all turned out. What he was doing, there was some concern about the scale of immigration. And his article was entitled, "Don't Listen to the Whingers, London Leads Immigrants."
Yes.
And he says, what's missing is not only a sense of the benefits of immigration, but also of where it came from. Now listen. He says this: "It didn't just happen. The deliberate policy of ministers from late 2000 until at least February last year, 2009, when the government introduced a points-based system, was to open up the UK to mass immigration." That from a man who had been at the heart of government. He then went on to explain how it had been done. He said later, he wrote that London's role as a magnet for immigration busted wide open the stale 1990 cliches about multiculturalism. It's a question of genuine diversity now, not just tacking a few Afro-Caribbean and Bengali events onto the white British mainstream. His words, not mine.
Yes.
Then he says, so why is it that ministers have been so very bad at communicating this? I wonder, because I wrote the landmark speech given by the then immigration minister, as we discussed, Barbara Roach, September 2000, calling for a loosening of controls. It marked a major shift from the policy of previous governments. Didn't it just? He then refers to the unit that did the think piece, and he says that this report, on which the policy was based, was surrounded by an unusual air of both anticipation and secrecy. Drafts were handed out in the summer of 2000 only with extreme reluctance. There was a paranoia about it reaching the media. I mean, just listen to this. It gets worse. I mean, this is extraordinary stuff. It's factual. He was there. Yes. He and his mates have made a fantastic difference to our society by means of conspiracy. It's nothing else. But the earlier drafts I saw also included a driving political purpose, that mass immigration was the way that the government was going to make the UK truly multicultural. I remember coming away from some discussions with the clear sense that the policy was intended, even if it wasn't its main purpose, to rub the right's nose in diversity and render their arguments out of date. That seemed to me to be a manoeuvre too far. At least he said that. He goes on, I've nearly finished this, but it is so important. Ministers were very nervous about the whole thing, for despite Barbara Roach's keenness to make her big speech and to be up front, there was a reluctance elsewhere in government to discuss what increased immigration would mean, above all, wait for it, above all for Labour's core white working class vote.
Yes.
Indeed so.
Yes.
And then he admits, I've nearly finished, the results were dramatic In 1995, 55,000 foreigners. A few years later, trebled. So you couldn't have clearer evidence.
Yes, exactly.
Of course, the Labour Party have said nothing about this. They were told to clam up. Nothing was said.
But don't you think, Andrew, it's extraordinary that this, I remember this very clearly, and
It didn't have much coverage.
It didn't have, that's the point.
No.
It was commented on, but it did not have coverage when you consider the magnitude of what was being said.
Exactly so.
Which I think really tends to confirm what you were saying earlier. I mean, essentially, this, you're talking about a media, broadcast media particularly, who are pro-immigration. What was interesting about that article by Andrew Neather too was that he's entirely for this, actually, isn't he?
Yes.
It's not like, this is not a criticism, is it?
He's entitled to his view.
Yes.
What he's not entitled to do as a civil servant or a political advisor, take part in a conspiracy to deceive the British public with a view to changing the whole nature of our society. It's outrageous.
Do you think that, as well, that, how should I put it, electoral advantage played any part in any of this? I mean, in terms of, for example, the Labour Party think, well, actually, essentially, we have many new voters here.
I think at the time the motivation was what he described it to be.
Yeah.
That is to make Britain much more multicultural. I think that is changing, and I think that the growth of the immigrant communities and the disparity between their voting, in the sense that something like 65% of black voters vote Labour, and I think in other communities it is not as strong as that, but the immigrant voters tend to vote Labour. So yes, I think now we're in a situation where Labour want to build on that. And to take an example, the Windrush affair has been weaponised by Labour against the Conservatives. Well, first thing to say is this went on for 50 years under both governments. Secondly, that you can't blame civil servants for it. They didn't know the technicalities of someone who arrived in the 1950s. My chairman, Alp Mehmet, is by this standard a Windrush child. He's done extraordinarily well. He was an ambassador. So, it's being deliberately weaponised and rather effectively.